first 30 minutes, I'm going to hand over to Diane Andoni from NFT3's CEO.
Hey, I hope everybody is great. Hey, Ed. It feels somewhat surreal to be as prosaic with you to say, hey, Ed. But hey, Ed, how are you?
I'm great. It's good to be with you. Ed is fine, by the way. People sort of see a distance there, but the important thing to remember is everybody is somebody. I'm just a normal guy. I just happen to be in a strange situation.
Fair enough. Just to add, because this is often a serious conversation that we end up having about the intersection of the autonomy and agency of the individual with the ascendance over the past little while of the surveillance state. So I want to introduce some levity at the outset, just so the audience can connect with you as a human, and I can connect with you as a human being. What is the experience like of being, and then we can get into more of the seriousness. What is the experience like, and I hope you take this kindly, of being played by a Hollywood actor?
It's really strange. I had the chance to meet JGL, who played me in the Snowden movie. Of course, I played myself in the actual documentary when it was happening. But he's a very talented, very kind guy. It's incredibly flattering to have someone like that, play you in a film. It's very strange, though. It's you can't really watch somebody pretend to be you in a film and not be a little bit unsettled by it. I think, particularly when he does like a Batman voice through the thing.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I'm going to somehow elegantly segue that into a more serious topic, which is when JGL was, filming Third Rock from the Sun. This is the direct period prior to. I really want to talk about getting into that period to frame and understand for our conversation. And also to frame and understand for the audience, the period of time after September 11th and how, that set up the context for what I personally think was the beginning of a little bit of a counter narrative to the benevolence of the nation state, at least in the context of the U.S. and other Western democracies. So I think that 8-year period was incredibly important to where we are now, and I wonder how you feel about that. I want to know, in terms of crypto coming into being and discourses about surveillance capitalism finding their feet, what do you think about this time period and how it affected you prior to where, the reason for you being here today, really?
Yeah, I mean, when we were sort of growing up, people of our age cohort, in that period, everything felt amazing. And then as we aged, it seemed that everything, fell apart. And, nobody is capable of governing. There's conflict everywhere. There's all kinds of cultural and moral panics. But the funny thing is, I've been blessed to be able to talk to activists from previous generations, like Daniel Ellsberg, people who lived through the civil rights protests of the last century, the Vietnam era resistance, and whistleblowers working against the sort of top secret America construction, as the Washington Post might put it, when it was in its infancy. And the thing is, when you have the benefit of that perspective, you see that what we feel like is in fact some new dynamic that didn't exist previously, everything's falling apart today, would actually be very fiercely contended by people who come at it from a different perspective. And we actually see a lot of that today in the sort of cultural conflicts that we face today, where people say we're looking at this from the wrong perspective, or from the wrong continent, or from the wrong color, or what have you. Everybody sees the world through a different lens. Now, what I will say is different is the way that this struggle for power is expressed. When we're talking about things like the civil rights protests, you're talking about water hoses and dogs and men in boots with sticks, right? You're talking about state governors and local laws and really oppression that is hyperlocal. Why? Because that's the technology that they had. What changed in that post 9/11 moment, in September of 2001 and onwards, is in response to a cultural panic that arose from an act of terrorism, which it's important to understand. We lose more people to COVID than we ever did from September 11th, but September 11th changed national policy for 2 decades. In very harmful ways. We went to wars that we could never extricate ourselves from. And most importantly, we reinterpreted the Constitution of the United States, what all of our laws meant, in secret. And the government then applied a new framework of technology to enforce their understanding of our rights and our laws in a new way. Now, in the previous century and all the centuries prior, this was not possible, right? The extent of the government's authority really came from where its voice could reach through media influence and where its hands could physically reach through its agents, right? Those people wearing boots and carrying sticks. Now, for the first time, they were able to take control of an infrastructure that had already begun to work its way into every home, into every workplace, and now into every pocket. We have to remember that smartphones weren't omnipresent back then. That would come years later. But the infrastructure upon which those smartphones would operate was already there. And this is what really changed, I think, in a historic way. The United States government operated in secret with a first mover advantage that it then shared in secret with the Five Eyes intelligence network. This is the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, sort of the Anglophone countries. And then they worked in an open, admitted conspiracy in government documents, and they say it in public since, to basically try to establish what they would describe as information dominance on the internet. Now, this was justified on the basis of terrorism, but 10 years and now 20 years later, when we look at the government's own investigations, they found that these programs were not especially effective in stopping terrorist attacks. What they were extraordinarily effective for was generating intelligence, right? And this makes sense to anybody who uses the internet in the most peripheral way. Think about it. If you could just type in anyone's email address and see what's in there, right? If you could type in anyone's IP address and see which sites they're connecting to, if you could look at someone's the connection data that's traveling from their cell phone, not even to see what's in it, but just to see this cell phone becomes active at this time of day and it becomes less active at this time of night. Well, now you know when they wake up. Now you know when they go to sleep. And if you could see this device move over the network, you know everywhere they move. Now, if you extrapolated that over everyone, everywhere, now you have the birth of what was in 2013 described as global mass surveillance. And that is what I would say is uniquely different and has changed in our generation.
Yeah, I sometimes I'll segue into the next question that I have, but I sometimes I almost want to skip ahead and say and we'll get to this I think more in a later talk, but the state's monopoly on the use of violence. Before we segue into this next question, I mean, it's after hearing you say this, it's almost like it's transmogrified into a use of violence on the information contained by the individual. Does that land for you?
I mean, we would have to describe, what is violence in this context? Are we talking, the iPhone jumping off the table and biting you? Of course, no. But are we talking about the fact that now, previously, if the state wanted to disrupt a protest movement, they had to infiltrate the protest movement, right? They had to figure out who the influencers are within it. They had to see who were the people who connected that protest movement to other protest movements. They had to basically identify the leadership on the social graph, right? The nodes that connect all of the other nodes, and then take those nodes off the board, arrest them, intimidate them, co-opt them, whatever they could do. And that took time. It took an enormous investment of people. It was not always successful. Well, now your iPhone already does that for you, right? They're constantly feeding that information, not just to the government, but to Apple, to Facebook, to Google, to whoever's running the apps and the SDKs that are resident on your phone. Now, once you have that, can it be used to instrumentalize violence? Of course. And at the same time, do we see that being commonly used to apply violence in the context, at least domestically, of the United States today? Not broadly. Do they do it in targeted instances? Absolutely. Anybody that they really don't like, we see it happen. But can it be applied in other ways, right? When you talk about violence, what we're talking about here is forcefully overcoming the absence of consent. What if they didn't have to do it forcefully? And that's what they're trying to realize, right? And because, like, why is Apple, why are Facebook, why are all these guys interested in this? They don't want to hit you with a stick. They can't. In theory, they'll go to jail. Probably not in today's world. But they're certainly not supposed to do it. But if they can influence the way you think, if they understand your entire social graph, they can influence the people that influence you. If they can insert into your timeline, right, of your doom scrolling or whatever, the headlines that you see, and they know that you don't click half of the articles that you see, you just see the headlines, they can shape your perception of the world, and then they no longer even need to apply violence. So really, what we see is violence becoming more of a continuum where it's not really about violence. Violence is the end state of influence. It's where all their other influence operations have failed, and now they're going to the last resort. But if they can use it as a increasingly smaller or an increasingly scarce lever, something that when used is then amplifies to the media to scare everybody else into compliance because they know I don't want to end up like that guy. It can still be effective even when you only pull the stick out on very rare occasions.
True enough, and agreed. When we catch up, to the winter and spring of 2013, I've always just, and maybe I hope this is not a duplication of efforts on your part that you've already explained this, but I've always just want to know, sort of for you to take me through the thoughts in your head when you decided to share this aspect of, the state that people probably had their eyes closed to, and it certainly resonated with me when you said everything was great. I felt like everything, like I assume you're talking about the mid 90s.
Right. Yeah. And like the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace era, where everybody who talked about the internet, everyone who wrote about the internet, like it was an obvious, unmitigated good. It was a space, a new commons of the mind where we would all come to meet, we would all construct and collaborate together. And governments were seen as sort of interlopers into this space. Corporations were not really welcome into this space. It was a public commons because it had yet to be privatized and commercialized.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny to me how you could almost draw an analog with blockchain to some extent within that kind of frameworks. But let's catch up to this because I want to just really kind of understand like when you what was your emotional state like, and I guess catch up to crypto in the sense that I understand recently that I think you released something about paying for the servers in BTC. What was the intersection of crypto at that time for you, and when did you first get into crypto and BTC, and what was that journey like? And I obviously it intersected with your journey of the leaks, and I'm curious about that whole milieu.
So There are a lot of questions in there. I think you asked generally about like my mental state in 2013, like what brought me forward. What it was I was working for the government as a contractor, but people think I worked at like a Booz Allen building in Hawaii or something like that. That's not really how top secret contracting works. You work in an NSA facility at an NSA desk under an NSA supervisor who has a blue badge, and the contractors simply have green badges, right? You're all part of the same team. You're all working on the same missions. You're all fulfilling the same tasks, essentially. It's just the government has legally regulated manpower caps on how many people can staff these executive agencies. And so they have to basically pay private companies to rent their employees to get around this cap, right? It's entirely an end run around Congress, where as long as they have the budget to rent people, they can violate these manpower caps by taking people who are nominally working for Dell or Booz Allen or whatever, but in practice, their de facto work is for government. And so that's what I was doing. And in my position there, I was working at something called the Office of Information Sharing. So I had to have all of the information. And so I had very broad accesses. I could see basically everything, and I was supposed to get people what they needed. I wasn't ever intended to actually end up in this position. It's sort of one of the strange coincidences of history I wrote about in my book, Permanent Record, if anybody's interested in the minutiae there. But I came across a classified inspector general's report that was still in the draft stage. This is a government investigation of itself into what was called the Stellarland program. Now, this was very unusual because this is basically a classified compartment, something called ECI, exceptionally controlled information, which you can think of as sort of as an above top secret thing. Not everybody who has clearance, even if they have the clearance to see it, is permitted to see it. And this is above and beyond normal controls, right? So we have these things called dirty word searches that people like myself, people with systems administration access, can construct to go, if you ever see this word on the system, and you may not even know what the word means, flag that file, pull it over, look at it. If it's in fact not supposed to be there, get rid of it. And so I got the results of one of these dirty word searches, and I saw this document that was way too highly classified to be where it was. And when I read it, what it said was that the government was knowingly, willfully violating the law. They were very likely violating the Constitution of the United States. And only a few members of Congress were aware of this. But the ones that did went along with it because they were afraid of being criticized. The courts were not interjecting in this, even though it was being challenged by things like the American Civil Liberties Union. Because they went, well, the government says it's classified and they're the authority on national security. So who are we to question the executive branch's judgment on whether it's national security related or not? And what had happened when you look at this in aggregate is that the government had found a way to hack around the limitations that our society had imposed on them. They'd gotten around law, they had gotten around oversight, they'd gotten around the Constitution. How did we reestablish that? And what I felt was that we, the public, even if we wanted this to happen, or we didn't want this to happen, we needed to know that it was happening in order to discuss it, right? In order to vote on it, in order to express the will of the governed. And that was being intentionally, willfully denied to us. So that, was something that obviously made me uncomfortable because I know what happens to people who stand up and say something about this. So it was really the end of my life as I knew it, and I thought I would end up in prison. I was not excited to do this. This was not something I wanted to do. And I knew it was going to mean that I would spend the rest of my life really in grim circumstances. Things have actually ended up better than that, but still not exactly what you would hope for. Anyway, again, for people who want more on that, I would refer you to my book because we've got time limitations here tonight. But to get to that second part of the question that you had there, which I don't know if you want to restate it just to bring our listeners
in terms of how in terms of how you saw it playing out 8 years later, and some differences in how you saw it playing out as opposed to what you felt then. But I really also wanted to kind of jump into the intersection of blockchain, crypto.
Right.
At that time, Bitcoin is really is
Right.
synonymous with crypto, and I really wanted to get us, like, you're buying these servers,
Yeah.
with BTC. I remember paying for some VPNs with BTC back in the day, and
Right.
I'm very remiss that I did this.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's lamentable.
God,
But
if I
but
thought
yeah,
about how much those servers cost today, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it's worth it, and I would have done it again. It helps get traction for the fact that the internet can have its own currency, um, and more importantly, uh, it would not have been possible to basically do this the way that I had intended to do it, where I divorced it from my identity for a period of time, right? I wasn't going in and buying Bitcoin from somebody in the coffee shop, although I should have been back then, because I didn't have time. And I had been using Bitcoin for the longest time to pay for servers, as you mentioned, for contributing to technical efforts against censorship with the Tor network for years. I think
I remember.
probably I had been involved since 2011. I'm not sure, in actively using it. But yeah, it was just simply a circumstance where I go, oh man, now I need to basically create one degree of separation. They would be able to find out eventually, because I wasn't trying to, again, do this in complete secrecy. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to pick up days. I wanted to pick up weeks. And, if you're paying for a server in a completely foreign country with a completely foreign currency from the perspective of the FBI, that buys you time. And it worked, right? A lot of people today would go, oh my goodness, this is scary. This is terrible. We don't want Bitcoin to be involved in speech crimes or whatever. But it is that ungovernable space that represents a need, right? Some people were talking about, like back then, the Silk Road and drug markets. And nowadays, when everybody's trying to go, oh, Bitcoin is the most legitimate thing in the world, you can put your baby to bed on Bitcoin. They go, oh, we can't mention the tragic past. Look, I'm not saying we want open air drug markets. A lot of you will say you do, and that's fine. That's a different debate. But what I am saying is that, what does it mean if nobody is able to engage in any kind of trade? No one is able to speak without the government's permission. And this is really what I want to sort of summarize here. When we talk about that track from the Declaration of Independence to cyberspace, to really the post 9/11 declaration of the subjugation or subordination of cyberspace. What September 11th represented from the intelligence community's perspective was the discovery of Pandora's box. The intelligence community had recognized that this new global network was spreading everywhere, but legally, lawfully, they were not able to surveil it the way that they surveilled, like satellite communications and whatnot, that weren't really generally used by the public, because it would involve domestic surveillance. They'd be spying on everyone everywhere, whether they live in, Detroit, or whether they live, in Berlin. But when they found this, it was simply too attractive to walk away from. So they found their way in, they opened it up, and now we're dealing with all of the evils that are sort of left behind. But the last thing remaining in Pandora's box, if you remember the old fable, was hope. And that's what we have to recognize today. This infrastructure is out there. It is being targeted. The network and the path that our communications must traverse is hostile. But so are many paths that we walk in life, whether it's a dark alley or anything else. Can we design methods to re-liberate the internet? And I think we can. If we do not recognize that there are places that the government may rightfully have an interest in regulating and want to regulate this for whatever reason, anti-monopoly or whatever, or they're trying to get terrorists or kidnappers, or saving the puppies, whatever you actually approve of, you recognize there may be some use for government there. We also have to recognize that governments inevitably will go too far. They will abuse their power. They will abuse their authority. How do we regulate the regulators? And this, I think, is one of the interesting things that originally attracted me to the idea of sort of the distributed ledger. And anybody could come up and take their little piece of it and take it back home and through their own responsibility, through their own investment, create a larger fabric, a larger network, a safety net that's held by 10,000 people as opposed to by 10, sitting in an unaccountable room somewhere where we don't even know what they're talking about. That is a scary prospect to governments. And it's scary to a lot of people who have not been involved in it, who don't understand how it works, who see it as a threat. And it's certainly a threat to a lot of bankers out there. It's frightening to them because they've been extracting rents for the last 1,000 years on the basis that only they were the ones who were invested with the authority to do this. But we can use science and technology, our understanding of mathematics as we develop as a species, to find ways that we can work collaboratively and cooperatively, even under hostile circumstances and difficult environments, to build something better. And I think that is the hope that's left in the box.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that there's always a devolution towards special interest if the overall framework or the dynamics of power is set as it is now. And if we can, iterate upon that via governance mechanisms within blockchain technologies, for example, or a more equitable value transfer layer that we're building right now through cryptocurrencies and otherwise, then I think that this is an optimistic avenue. And it's also a time for us, I think, to maybe pause, because we're going to bring someone into the conference here. And I won't say who it is. I'll leave that for our host, who I think is very germane to that discussion. And I cannot wait until I can talk to both of you at once. So we'll wait for their introduction. And thank you for this time. Ed, I can call you Ed.
My pleasure. Yeah.
You'd let me. Okay. And thank you for this time. And we'll take a little break and introduce our next guest.
Be right back. Thank you so much.
Now, I am so excited to bring you. We're diving into the future of Web 3.0, and together there is no two better guests I can think of that we're pairing to have this conversation. We're bringing this to you live. This is a Blockdown D-Data historic moment. We have Edward Snowden, and then we also have joined with Gavin Wood, co-founder of Ethereum and creator of Polkadot. I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm going to hand it over to Dylan now to take it away.
Okay, and we are back. Welcome to Gav, and I hope you're well. I see, and I just want to say first, how did the thing I really want to know is, how did Snowden inspire your own work? And I know you've written about this, and I think that there's some really extremely, I'm just so compelled and curious to know that if there was some cross-pollination in terms of, inspiring your work, Gav, and here we sit on the precipice of Web3 and a more optimistic avenue toward, frameworks for governance. And I really want to know, like, how were you inspired? And then, Ed, if you can speak to, some of your thoughts about, is this an optimistic avenue, and what are you optimistic about? If we can go on that, please.
First, thanks for inviting me on. It's lovely to be here and have the chance to actually interact directly for a little while. The first, I did write this article on Web3 like back in 2014. And actually, if you go back to the article, I have it up here now. It's I think that like the third paragraph of the article actually calls it the post-Snowden web, right? This was very it was a bit of a kind of like a revelation at the time. I remember it's like March, April time, and somehow the two had been separate. The whole Bitcoin and Ethereum, the whole sort of blockchain crypto movement had been interesting, but it was one different sort of box in my mind and life, rather separate to this, this sort of the revelations that were very helpfully published, back in 2013, I think. I know there was this revelation moment where I realized that this wasn't, whole Bitcoin and Ethereum, this consensus technology wasn't just a kind of a reaction to the to the incompetence of the regulators and bankers in 2008, but it was really a wholly different approach to interhuman interaction on a global level, that addressed, or that could address, many of the issues that had come to light in a very dramatic way with these revelations. And I saw it as being very clearly a piece of technology that could really help society move away from these really sort of fundamental issues of trust. And so this sort of concept of this platform that could move society in this direction, and addressed some of these issues, at least, was I felt deserved a different name to crypto and to blockchain, because it sort of brought in a few other things as well. It brought in elements of like BitTorrent and Freenet and Tor, right? It wasn't simply about the ability to have a free currency of the internet. This was about creating a whole new platform to eclipse the sort of traditional technologies that we'd used that were very authority based, and so it sort of deserved to be called something quite different. And then it was like, what does it call? Well, it's the next iteration of this like massively multi-user application framework that we kind of call Web 2. So it's kind of Web 3, and then it was also like, well, maybe it should be sort of named after the guy that sort of really shone a light on this and demonstrated that society really, really needs this technology. So, I was kind of in two minds. Post-Snowden Web 3 caught on.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Fair enough.
But yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned that, particularly that you mentioned the influences from sort of the prior works of the internet, the BitTorrent type distribution. Because I think back to the classical tradition, the idea of the great conversation that unites us over generations with the thinkers of the past. And each time as we think, what is the way forward to the better world? Our fellows. If I'm optimistic, this is why I'm optimistic. We had this beautiful thing in the internet that was given to us, and not given to all of us. Some of you are old enough that you helped build it, right? But there is a countervailing force that has taken the internet to exploit it. They have accepted it as a gift to themselves, to the exclusion of everyone else. And I'm thinking of powerful central forces here, whether they are governmental or whether they are corporate. And we actually see this, I think, beginning to distort the blockchain space quite clearly. I think all of you are much more familiar with it than I am, where we see a lot of projects that are being sort of manipulated or contorted or shaped or reshaped to be as politely as possible, much more fair to the investors of the project than they are to the public in general. And I think that's a corruption to the ideals of the space, the framework of what it should be, what it could be, and what, in my opinion, and ultimately actually my belief, it will be. And that's because you've got all of these projects, some of which are very cleverly self-serving, some of them are very transparently self-serving. And on the other side, you have more publicly serving alternatives. I think over time, over iterations, the common interest will win over the selfish interest. There is some benefit to selfish interest, right? We need to basically allow people the space to try and be self-serving, to try and get ahead, because that incentive drives a lot of creative urges and a lot of people to do work that they would not otherwise perform unless they had this big carrot dangling ahead of them. But in the internet space, in the blockchain space, what we have seen, I think, is people not trying to simply chase the carrot or a carrot, but all carrots. And in so doing, they're claiming them for themselves to the exclusion of everyone else. This is the same when we look at the internet broadly. What Facebook is doing is trying to basically take every carrot in the world and lock it in a Facebook box, an Instagram box, a WhatsApp box that then no one else can interoperate with, no one can access. And if you want to so much as smell their carrot, right, you have to pay Facebook money. And the funny thing is, when you're using Instagram, when you're using Facebook, you're not even in the same room as the carrot. The carrot is exclusively for the advertisers, because back to that earlier idea that we were talking about, violence and influence. What Facebook sells is influence, right? It's on that same spectrum. It's the softer side. But what they are trying to do is they're trying to manipulate and shape behavior for rent.
Gavin, I think that this is a kind of like a very interesting thing for you to chime in on, because there's been for some, perhaps it's arguable that there's been for some new L1 entrants, and this is for more of our blockchain-oriented audience, perhaps, new L1 entrants that have sacrificed a level of decentralization for some sort of performance, and this is sitting outside of the discussion, perhaps, of that speculative impulse, which is absolutely valid.
Yeah, but I'm aware of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I wasn't. I just, for our audience, not for the audience that was. Yeah.
No, I'm not offended. It's a great question.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, Gavin, if you could chime in on your thoughts about this, I think that would be lovely.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the bottom line here is that, Bitcoin would not exist if all of the Bitcoin nodes had to sit in the same data center, had to be bought from the same company, and had to be synced from one of the very few privileged individuals that had access to the historical transaction set. The reason that Bitcoin exists today is because you didn't require any fundamental privilege in order to join in and run the network, and indeed verify that everybody who was running the network was doing it correctly. And the reason that this non-privileged or non-permissioned, trustless, open, transparent, whatever you want to call it, decentralized, this attribute of the Bitcoin network allowed it to exist in this kind of, Edward called it, ungovernable. I like this word, illegal, right? It's kind of like outside of the scope of human law. This is in natural law, right? This is kind of like the laws of the physical laws, the laws of the universe. You can't take the wind to court for blowing your house down, even though it is damage.
Yeah. Can't take the wind to court yet.
And it's like Bitcoin was this this illegal force, right? And we created it. I say we as humans, yeah, through mathematics, basically mathematics, economics, game theory. We mix these together in this crazy recipe. Bitcoin came about, and it was a force that could not be stopped. Well, as soon as these forces become stoppable because they are overly centralized, then they will cease to get this kind of carte blanche, ungovernable, illegal attribute, and they will become inherently very governable, which basically means, in Edward's earlier terms, that people with sticks may well turn up at doors and demand that these nodes stop processing transactions from these individuals, or whatever else that they want to do. And if that's the case, then it is effectively, it's working against the, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, the token holders, the participants, the stakeholders in these networks, because these networks will cease to be what they are meant to be, right? They will cease to have this value proposition that Bitcoin had, and they will become just like another form of centralized service, not entirely different to, Amazon, Google, Facebook, whatever.
Yes, fair enough and agreed. Edward, do you want to chime in further on that?
Oh, no, I think I largely agree with the proposition there. This is something that I would actually extend to one of the debates that I've been writing about recently on my Substack, central bank digital currencies and their entrance into the space, where they are particularly threatened by the presence or existence of stable coins, such as they are. Right, particularly when people start talking about like Tether and whatnot, they're like, somebody is creating a dollar equivalent or soaking a dollar out of our ecosystem, and then they're replacing it with what? We don't know, whatever. What if we just flood the zone with our own competitor? And we see, I think, when we talk about stable coins, there are these centrally issued stable coins coming from, Coinbase or wherever, that have built into their smart contracts things like blacklists and freezing capabilities for contracts, and they have the ability to like burn other people's addresses, and to me this defeats the idea of what a DAO or stablecoin is. A stablecoin that has blacklisting, in my opinion, is not a stablecoin. And this is why I would prefer something like a DAI, or I don't know how to pronounce it. I've only seen it written, but MakerDAO's thing, the DAI, because that doesn't have that. It is collateralized and openly sort of visible to the network. There is no question about what's backing it because you already see what's there. And, these things can be voted on, they can be adjusted. And this is kind of a model to me where we see something, the government offers, for example, its CBDCs, or Coinbase offers its next, thing, or Facebook finally comes forward with whatever its thing is, and they're all trying to basically wash tokens out of one economy, whether that's the dollar economy, whether that's out of crypto economy or whatever, into their space. And this is a lot of the competition that I think we see in the blockchain space today. It's very zero sum. And the question that I have to ask is, when we start to look at these older models, actually, that are more tested, that are more proven, like the Bitcoin model, or, like a sort of over-collateralized model that's on network and open, and more free, that it is centrally regulated. And then you have a CBDC out there, central bank issued digital currency, where they just say, hey, we just created $10 trillion and we sent them to everybody's bank account. But if you don't use them in a week, they disappear, right? And this is what China is test driving today. They can give sort of rebates to juice the economy wherever, but your money has an expiration date. And this gets to the inflation controversies that are happening all over the public domain today. People are beginning to ask a question that has been largely forgotten. One of the privileges of government classically has been to spend other people's money. if we stop talking about other people's money and we start talking about your money, and we start not talking about strictly legally authorized taxes that have gone through long debates and are just continuously, relentlessly covered by media, and we start talking about more secretive forms of taxation, whether it's being performed by a company, whether it's being performed by a government, who should be able to spend your money other than you? We can create networks that answer that question, and I think they will be more competitive than ones that are, shall we say, less transparent.
Thank you. I think it's worthy then at this point to talk about, what Web 3.0, or excuse me, I've been told that that's Web 3. I should not say Web 3.0. That was changed at some point in the past. Web 3 will look like in 10 or 20 years. I understand that's an extremely long scope of time in our world today. But what do you both think it will look like? And Gavin, excuse me, I'll shoot this to you, please.
Well, yeah, it is it is pretty long time scale. I generally deal in like maybe at most 6 months, 3 years. 10 or 20. I mean, we're going to see. It's going to be a very interesting social experiment because we're going to see just how much the world cares about privacy, self-sovereignty, transparency, knowing that the rules, their assumptions about how a system or a service works are true. And I think this actually, it's an interesting, it's a slight difference with I think what Edward was saying earlier with the stable coins that like USDC or whatever versus like DAI. I'm not against like stable coins that are centrally issued. I think that there is, they are logic, right? And at the end of the day, I consider my job as like a trust-free consensus software guy is to develop systems where the stated rules are enforced. Now, if the stated rules allow a central issuer to freeze an account, well, look, if you don't want to be a part of the system, you go use some other system that doesn't allow a central authority to freeze an account. I don't think it's feasible, if nothing else, to build a world where only one kind of paradigm can exist. I think there have to be choices here, and I see this as just like another choice. And although I may not particularly want to use a centrally issued currency myself, as long as there are like options and choices, and as long as the rules, so much as they can be written in logic, can be like guaranteed to be enforced, then I think I consider that to be like the key contribution of the consensus element, at least, of Web3. So like in 10 or 20 years time, my hope for the world would really be that we have these, global services that we massively multi-user, we broadly refer to it as the web now. We have these services that provide us with de facto guarantees, like hard guarantees on the rules that are open and transparent, that we can read, whether it's in code, whether it's in English, that we can read and get a credible belief that they will be followed. And that's something that I see as really, really missing from the world, that this kind of like pre-Bitcoin, pre-blockchain, I suppose if we're doing it properly, like pre-BitTorrent, pre-peer-to-peer world, right? The world was very much based around a trusted authority providing a service. It had to be from society to develop to get to the point that it is. But in 10 or 20 years, it would be my hope that we've moved away from this paradigm and that we're into a paradigm where services do not need, or service providers do not need to be trusted. We can verify.
Thank you, Gavin. And as a rejoinder to that, is your proposal then that we would have, some people might choose on the shelf of DAOs, the benevolent dictatorship DAO, and 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 I think that that's possible. I mean, some people. I think that the concept that you should be able to choose is sound and should be fundamental.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's
wonder
the
what you
basis
think.
of experimentation, right? It's like it's the basis of evolution is to have many
Mm,
different paths, and the path that that delivers the best, that is best fitted for the environment, delivers the best, I don't know, opportunity, service, whatever, advantageousness to the um, to humanity, to society as a whole, should be the one ultimately that wins out.
We've come into a really interesting
thanks.
debate here, so let me wade back in because I think Gavin, makes an important point, but I have to be sort of the dark side here, counter argue for the sunshine and roses take, because no one comes to me for sunshine and roses, which is that's true and it sounds persuasive, but antifreeze leaks from a car and animals drink it. It's an attractive nuisance, right? There's something that seems better. It is sweeter. So their brain is tricked into believing this is more beneficial. It's easier. It's there. I didn't have to work for it. Let's get it. And they die as a result, right? It's the same with swimming pools that, don't have fences around them. Little kids go to them. And, it's these same things happen all over the place economically. This is really what Web 2 is. We lost the distributed state of the original web, where we were all sort of homesteaders and proprietors. We had terrible, kludgy little websites that we tapped out in text editors. They were not beautiful, but they were ours. The servers were, under our desk, or whether it's at a university or at your home. And bit by bit, we made the barriers to entry lower. We created greater opportunities for inclusion for people who lacked access to the resources or the computation or the technical know-how to do this. But people exploited that imbalance of power, right? And they constructed what they believed in their heart, truly believed, was a force for good in the world. See, for example, Google's original "Do No Evil." But over time, as it corporatizes, as it iterates within itself, it begins to decay, because this is the same with our governments. This is the same that we're seeing today. The stewardship of a society is a constant drain on hours, on sort of psychic energy. You have to constantly be working, getting out of your bed, trying to make things better in a small way, just to keep things the same, because the forces of entropy are tilting us toward decay, and the nature, human nature and corruption, tilt us toward that decline. I do think that this distribution and this explosion of choices is likely. What I am concerned about, and will remain concerned about, is the first mover advantage, the network effect, and particularly anti-competitive behavior by market leaders and by those who have a lot of resources. And this is just sort of the concern. What we see, I think, in a lot of these spaces is where regulation, or the regulatory authority, or a advantage of any kind like that, an unshared advantage, is used to advantage a certain class to the detriment of their competitors, whether we're talking about states versus non-states, whether we're talking about market incumbents versus market entrants, whether we're talking about startups versus what. Just the question that I would have for Gavin with this, to bring it all back, is there is this tendency toward winner takes all. And if we presume those who have unfair or unreasonable advantages, whether we're talking legal or, as you say, illegal, because it cuts both ways, some ways in interesting forms, how do you guard against the natural tendency towards centralization of reward, when we have for the first time sort of just a hand on the string that we hope can help us climb out of the well of this toward a more decentralized or a more distributed apportioning of power?
Well, I'm not sure if this is something that can be. This may well be above my pay grade.
Fair enough.
Power, like, I can't solve what is inherently an issue with humanity.
True, and none of us can. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here. This is just thinking out loud, right?
But like, I think so that I would say that there are two things that, broadly speaking, can reduce the issues that come with individuals having outsized power. One of them is transparency. So I just to put it there, I don't think that a world where everybody has literally the same amount of power is necessarily a world that we would want to live in.
Sure.
Right? In the same way that, like, we don't necessarily want to exist in a world where everybody has over. And I think incorruptibility of rules. So if we have, if the rules are transparent and if we know that they are blanket enforced, then this at least keeps those that have more power than others in check. So in my mind, this technology can help in so much as it avoids egregious corruption of the rules that is only really possible in these very opaque power structures, some of which that you were mentioning earlier in the US government.
Fair enough.
Edward, I think you were trying to make a couple points in there, and I wasn't quite sure if you were able to get them through. Would you mind restating them? Because I wasn't sure I heard anything out of your mic. Well, Gavin.
I was just saying with Gavin's point, actually, I think he is correct in a certain way. We don't necessarily want everyone to have exactly the same power, or if we do, we want to encourage coordination and cooperation, joint construction over sort of a anti-collaborationist model for the whole world. It's just a question of when we recognize that there are these centralizing forces, right? There's these centers of gravity that will naturally come to exist in any competitive space. How do we sort of ensure fairness in a world where people are taking very anti-regulatory positions? Because classically, right, when we're talking about the centralized authorities, you've got regulators. But what happens when the regulators don't act or act corruptly, right? Or we move to a space where we don't have the benefit of them at all? That was the question widely. But I think Gavin's made his point, and we're good on that.
Great. We may not have a sensibility of what it looks like in 10 or 20 years exactly, but is it fair to say that it looks potentially better? Is that fair to say? Is there consensus on that? If the world is truly adopting Web3 under sort of our collective imagination of what a Web3 adopted world looks like. Are we agreed on that?
So for my part, I certainly wouldn't be spending my life, 14 hours a day every day building this if I didn't think it was going to be an overall positive thing for the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a good thing for the world if we make it so. And that's really my point. For everybody out there who uses these networks or who's interested in this or who thinks there's going to be an impact or is threatened by it, The only way things change is if you make them change. Like Gavin says, his 14 hours a day, that counts for something. That is a measure of influence. We all have influence, whether we apply it, whether it is applied correctly through our efforts, or whether it's sort of stolen from us and manipulated and shaped through these outside parties that are influencing us or our thinking or whatever. That's a battle that we fight every day, and we continuously will. When we talk about Web3, one of my primary concerns, just beyond the sort of inevitability of the space, and I think we will see a growing importance here, and I think that can be a tremendously positive force. I am afraid of, as always, the corruption of privilege that exists within these spaces. And one of the things that concerns me that we haven't really talked about is like the NFT-ishness that's around the space. I'm not against NFTs. I think they can be great. I've seen them used successfully for fundraising. I've used them for fundraising for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And the generosity of the community is, astounding. At the same time, I see them creeping into gaming in a way that a lot of people are excited about. But as somebody who's been playing games for a very long time, I'm like, hang on, hold up a second. We used to go to the store. We used to buy a game. You own the game. You play the game. That's it, right? Then you got the subscription model of games where you got a massively multiplayer game or something like that. And you buy the game and then you pay a monthly fee or something like that. Now we have people that are trying to sort of, maybe they're not even trying to, but the ultimate result of what they're doing is they are injecting an artificial sense of scarcity into a post-scarcity domain. And I think that is actually an inherently antisocial urge here. If you think about the world that people are retreating from their games, right? Where they live in a cold, bare box, if they're lucky enough to even have a home, in some overly expensive city. They spend all their time working. They get home exhausted. They make their cheap meal, and then they turn on their device to escape from all that. And then in their digital world, where they're on a beautiful island, they build a beautiful home, right? And they want to change the color of the wall, and you got to pay $19.99 for the wall, or for a token that'll let you roll for the potential to maybe recolor your wall. There is something horrible and heinous and tragic in that, to me. Not everyone does that, and I'm not saying it has to do that, but I think the community should very much be trying to bend the arc of development away from injecting artificial, unnecessary scarcity entirely for the benefit of some investor class into these post-scarcity domains. Because one of the promises, one of the privileges of technology is that it frees us from material limits that only exist in a material space. To try to reimpose a material limit in an immaterial space, I think is a little bit unethical, but that's me personally.
Gavin, what say you to that?
I would actually ask a quick question. If suppose it were not for the benefit of the initial investors or whatever the stakeholders, but suppose that it were just done in some fashion that didn't actually inherently benefit any individual, just that scarcity was just part of the technology. Do you think that alters the equation a bit?
I think, of course, it does, but it's still on the same spectrum, right? So there is a question here of what is it that's being scarce, right? And what are we gating? Is it someone's effort, right? Did someone create an artwork? Did someone write a poem? Did someone craft something in a game that took them 30 hours? And it represents their 30 hours. That is a very different thing. That's tokenizing their effort. It's tokenizing human life, really, human expression in a certain way, and guarding and protecting that and allowing them to trade that. What they've done there is they've crystallized a property right of an act of creation and then permitted a kind of transferability. On the other hand, is it a random number generator that's just spitting out seed values, or it's a casino lever arm, right, where you're putting in tokens and you're hoping to get in rare or an ultra rare or super rare or whatever they call it? These are very different things, and that's what I'm recognizing.
So it's
Understood.
interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because like the game is a product. So it's a product. It's a digital product. It's not entirely dissimilar to another digital product, which, for example, could be music. So suppose you had an NFT, and you, with your NFT, you have to hold the NFT to be able to play this piece of music. Now, the artist that created that piece of music, I mean, I presume that since you've already sort of, you know, dipped your toes in the NFT thing, selling NFTs for raising funds, you would be okay with the artist who created a piece of music to sell NFTs of their music attached to the right to actually listen to this music. But isn't that the same thing as selling an artifact within a game if you are the game developer?
I think it's a very different thing. In fact, and we see this in traditional mobile games, and like there's a Japanese gacha model, is what it's called, where all of these loot box things, I think they're known of more generally, where you're not paying for a guaranteed product. You're not paying for a concert ticket. You're not paying for an album. You're paying for the chance, the potential. What they're trying to do is they're trying to sell you a chance at something without the promise of something. And I think that distance is where a lot of and I think the people who develop these systems are quite good at understanding these statistical models. I think if you want to sell a concert ticket, and that's, again, represented as a token, whether that is a ticket, whether that is an NFT, that's a different thing than the casino lever.
Okay, so just to clear things up then, let's disregard the concept. Like this, what I'm talking about is effectively like a CD NFT. So like basically a piece, like the music cannot be played outside of owning this NFT. So the artist has just linked the NFT to the music, right? So there isn't any physical element to this, like a concert performance. This is really just the ability to listen to the music. So I suppose the technology existed to allow the artist to restrict those who listen to their music to the owners of the NFT, which the artist would sell in order to fund, I don't know, maybe themselves further development for more music. Is that okay?
Again, all of these things, I think you're trying to create like binaries, where what I'm saying is all of these things exist on a spectrum of goodness, badness, right? And there's sort of self-interest and there's altruism. In a world of entire self-interest, right? Everything is cutthroat and, winner takes all, but you rule over a world of bones and ashes. On the other side, absolute altruism, your children starve because you gave all your food to them, and then you died because you starved to death, and then they could not produce food for themselves, and they died. There has to be reasonableness somewhere in this spectrum. You have to be careful not to fall too far on either side. In the sort of example as what you're describing, this is just another re-implementation of digital rights management, which generally does not get me excited. I'm not in love with it. But I can understand how these things could be applied usefully or pro-socially in certain instances. There are other people who would very strongly disagree with me. But all you're effectively talking about there, the token is a password, right? We're using the cryptographic properties of cryptocurrencies to basically provide an access right, whether that's a playing right, whether that's a streaming right, whatever. It's simply a technical measure. The implementation of it lies somewhere on that spectrum, as I said, but as you said before, maybe that's above my pay grade.
Yeah, I mean, so just to go back to the game, I would therefore say, I don't have any issue with games developers restricting access to their product in the same way that, they already have done for decades before. And I see NFTs as just like, a more agile way of restricting access to their product. And I don't know, I'm not I don't think I've gambled, more than like twice in my life. But I don't know. Like, I don't really have much of an opinion on whether gambling should be or probabilistic, services should be is a good thing or a bad thing. But like, I would separate that from the broader concept of like NFTs providing this agile restriction set.
Sure. Just to be fair, to reiterate on that, I'm not saying all gambling is bad or should be forbidden or whatever. People have the right to make their own decisions. At the same time, what I want people to focus on and what I want the community to focus on are predatory practices, are extractive practices, are exploitative practices. Fundamentally, a violation of the spirit of fairness. That's all I'm saying.
I think that point is well taken. In the spirit of gambling, I was gambling on interrupting you two legends speaking, so I apologize, and I hope you take that kindly. We are in fact over time. We've let this run a bit over time because I think everyone in the group here, certainly you two, are mavericks, so it is on brand that we've run over time, and we certainly all wanted to hear more of you speak. I would just say I hope that moving forward, this idea about NFTs, if I can chime in on that, I think that identity will play a central role in all of this. And if you guys have any final words on how identity plays into this, we'll give you 3 minutes each because we are over time. And I feel like this is a presidential debate or something, but please, since you spoke last, or I think you spoke last, and so Gavin, if you want to take this, please.
Okay, so very quickly, identity actually came up at one of when Edward spoke at the Web3 summit a few years back, and I think I don't really want to parrot what he said then, but it did strike a chord with me. I think identity is something that we do need to be very careful about. It's very much, we want to see services in society where there are objective, non-privileged ways of determining who should get, because most services cannot be provided to everyone all the time. So we need objective, non-privileged ways of deciding who should be able to use these services and who is not allowed to use these services simply through, because of the service cannot be provided to everybody. And identity is a very powerful instrument, and used incorrectly, it would restrict and it would create privileged sets of people that can use services that may ultimately be very important services to use against the overall benefit for society. So I think there needs to be a very broad awareness amongst teams, amongst developers, and within the community about how identity should be used in these products that we're building.
Thank you, Gavin. Edward?
I think largely largely we're in concert there. The one thing that I will sort of extend, again, because I think we don't have a lot of people in the blockchain space who are sort of saying, hey, slow down, be careful on this. Gavin admirably actually is saying, let's be cautious here. It gets back to that material limit, right? Identity is a discriminator. That is the purpose of it, to distinguish one from the other. Discrimination generally in the global space has negative consequences as we see it being applied at scale. As Gavin said, there are really important places where we need to be able to discriminate. One per customer. We don't have enough to go around for this, whether it's a product, whether it's food, whether it's housing, whether it's whatever. We need to see where's the connection to fairness. Now, what we don't need is human identity necessarily in this. What we need is that sense of fairness. In individual identity versus I can't think of the word for it, but validity of access, right? You have yet to be served. You need to be served. There's a limited amount of whatever. There's a material limit to the amount of service that can be provided. And so we want to provide it as fairly as possible if we can't get to everyone, right? So basically you get your ticket through the turnstile, good for one transit. But what I mean by that doesn't need to necessarily be individual, or what we need to be careful with is when we start saying it's this person, it's this biometrics, it's this whatever, and that identity begins to become discriminated against. But it is actually valid. They should still have a right to service for this, that, or the other. People need to be able to change identities. People need to have basically, all of their access cards that are divorced from their physical, human, discriminated against in many other domains identity, from their I need to get water or I will die identity, right? And I think how we tokenize this and crystallize this is very difficult, and it makes me nervous in general. However, we've seen a lot of clever solutions to a lot of difficult problems in the past, and I am very encouraged by the kind of thinking that I see and the inventiveness in this space that I see. What I want to caution against simply is overconfidence. Oh, we figured this out, and then you get something horrible like WorldCoin, where they build an eyeball catalog, and they don't even realize it. They don't think it's for that. They go, "We don't know how we would use it. We don't know how it would be abused." But like they saved a giant database of everybody's eyeball hashes, and then who knows what future use it will be put to, because they were simply trying to verify and tokenize humanness, individual humanness. And it's a clever solution to a difficult problem. But it can create greater risks down the road.
Thank you so much. And thank you both, Edward and Gavin, legends in your own right. Thank you very much for being part of this inaugural DData conference. I hope to rope you guys into a future one, because I think that it would be extremely worthy in a year from now, 2 years from now, to revisit some of these topics, to see how far we have come or not in Web3 and in our, in society, right, and for the world. So thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here. And my heart, I want to say my heart goes out to you, but it seems to land wrong. But my heart goes out to you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Okay. I really enjoyed it, Gavin. Stay free, everyone.
Likewise, Edward.
Wow, well, it's December 2021, and I have to say that is the best panel discussion that I've personally listened in on all year. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on Theta group chat as well. Share me who you think you kind of resonated with the most during that amazing conversation. Now, next up, we're looking ahead to Blockdown Festival 2022. I'm going to hand it over to the EAK Digital